B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Pesachim Daf Samach Hey. We're going to start 2 lines from the top of the Omid. Says the Gemara, Yotzto kat rishono v'chulu. We saw in the Mishnah on Daf Samach Daled Omid Aleph that the Korban Pesach was brought in 3 groups. The first group, the second group, the third group. The third group was always relatively smaller than the other groups, and we saw in the Mishnah that even though in the other groups the Leviim would manage to say the whole of Hallel twice before finishing the shlita of all the korbanos Pesach of that group. In the third group, they never even got to the point of Ohavti ki yishma Hashem in Hallel, even just once. Says the Gemara Tana. The Brisa says, Hi nikras kat atzlonis. This third group was called a lazy group. Asks the Gemara, V'haloi sagi telav hochi. We've learnt in the previous daf that there was a mitzvah to split everybody into 3 groups. That's the way it was supposed to be done. It wasn't possible that everybody should be in the first or second group. So why are you labeling the third group as being lazy? Answers the Gemara, they should have, each and every one of them should have made sure to go hastily and make his way to the first group rather than to the last group. It's true that we need the third group, but the individuals in the third group should have really tried their best to get into an earlier group. Kedetanya Rabbi Omer, and a similar concept that something that's inevitable, it has to happen, nonetheless it's somewhat a negative, and that's Ef shel ha'olam b'lo boisem. The world cannot exist, or the world needs to have spice merchants, or below borsi. We also need the tanners, those that are tanning the hides, the skins. Obviously, those who are engaged in working with the spices, the smell is very good. Those who are busy tanning the skins, the smells are very bad. Ashrei misha umnosei besam. Fortunate is the one who his craft is with spices. Oiloi lemisha umnosei borsi. And shame or woe to the person who his work, his craftsmanship is working with the skins. Similarly, the world cannot exist without boys and girls. Fortunate is the one whose offspring are boys, and less fortunate is the one whose offspring are girls. So you see there that even though it's inevitable and we need everything, we need the spices, we need the tanners, we need the boys, we need the girls. However, fortunate are those that belong to one group, less fortunate are those who belong to the other group. The same applies with Korban Pesach. Of course, we need 3 groups. The last group are less fortunate, and in the last group we actually blame them somewhat. We label them as being lazy because they should have put in the effort to get into an earlier group. Continues the Gemara. We saw in the Mishnah, Kamaseu b'choil v'chulei. We saw in the Mishnah that whatever they would do on a weekday Erev Pesach, they also did on a Shabbos on Erev Pesach. The Kohanim, they would rinse the floor of the Azorah, and that was, even though it was Shabbos, they would always do it on every other day. They would do it on Erev Pesach because of the amount of blood that was there. But on Shabbos, the Chachomim held that it should not be done, and they did it anyway. Asks the Gemara, Sheloi b'rtzoin man. Who are these Chachomim? Which opinion is it that has an issue with sweeping or with cleaning the floors of the Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos? Omer of Chizda, Sheloi b'rtzoin Rabbi Eliezer. It's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer who was opposed to what they were doing, and the other Chachomim were okay with it. Because according to the Rabbanon of Rabbi Eliezer, we'll soon see what this is about. Ha'omri shvusu, the Rabbanon say that sweeping a floor is only also with the Rabbanon on the regular Shabbos or Yom Tov. Ve'en shvus b'mikdash, and the shvus doesn't apply in the Beis Hamikdash, as we saw previously in the Gemara. We saw at the end of Eruvin that most things that are only Osir Midrabanon did not apply in the Beis Hamikdash, and since according to the Rabbanon sweeping is only ever Osir Midrabanon, therefore in the Beis Hamikdash it was okay. Rabbi Eliezer, however, holds that sweeping on Shabbos is Osir Min HaTorah, and therefore he held that it should not be done in the Beis Hamikdash. Maihi. Where do we find this machlokas Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachomim regarding sweeping floors? The Tanya we learnt in a Brisa, we learnt this in Shabbos Daf Tzadik Hey. Echod hachaylev, somebody who milks a cow. V'amachabetz, and somebody who strains the congealed milk, separating the cheese part from the water part. V'amegabein, and somebody who builds up all the cheese and to make cheese. He takes all the harder, the congealed part of the milk in order to make a solid block of cheese. Kagregris, all those, if one does it the size of a dried fig, he's transgressed these melachas on Shabbos. Hamachabet, somebody who sweeps the floor. V'hamarabet, somebody who sprinkles water to dampen the dust that it should settle on the floor. V'haroide chaluis devash, and somebody who removes the honeycombs from the hives or from wherever they are. So, and removing these honeycombs is also a melacha. Then b'shoigeg, if any of these were done by mistake on Shabbos, b'Shabbos chayev chatos. It's one of the lamates melachis. If he did it intentionally, he'll be chayev koros. If there were edim, he'll get a skila. He did it by mistake, it'll be chayev chatos. On Yom Tov, where there's no skila or koros, there's no chatos, hizid be Yom Tov. If he did it on purpose, on Yom Tov loikes arboim, he will get malchus. Divi Rabbi Eliezer. That's Rabbi Eliezer who says that all the above mentioned are isurim in HaTorah, one of them being mechabed, sweeping the floor, because when you sweep the floor, inevitably you're going to level out some of the grooves in the floor, and that is one of the av melachis, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's considered boineh. Similar to building. The Chachomim say, echod zeh ve'echod zeh. According to Rashi, this is referring to mechabed, sweeping, umerabet, and roide chalis devash, that either sweeping or dampening the dust or removing the honeycombs. According to Rabbi Eliezer, eine ela mishum shvus, they're only osur midrabanon. And then you have over here that when regarding sweeping, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's osur min HaTorah. Therefore, in the Beis Hamikdash it was osur, and therefore, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the Kohanim should not have done it. And those are the Chachomim that the Mishnah was referring to, who were displeased with what the Kohanim did. However, according to the Chachomim who argue with Rabbi Eliezer, then on a regular Shabbos outside the Beis Hamikdash, sweeping is only osur midrabanon, and therefore in the Beis Hamikdash it was mutter. And Tosfos here discusses why should there be an issue of mechabed, of sweeping in the Beis Hamikdash. The floor was made of stone, there were no grooves there, and Tosfos says that between the rows of stones there were grooves, and they would be leveled out by sweeping, and therefore there would be an issue. Rav Ashi Omar, Rav Ashi says, so that was Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said, Shloi b'rtzoin chachomim is Rabbi Eliezer. Rav Ashi says, Afilu teima shloi b'rtzoin chachomim. Even the chachomim that we just saw before, who hold that sweeping on Shabbos is only osur midrabanon, they would also agree that in the Beis Hamikdash they should not have done it. Even though we know there's a rule, ein shvus b'mikdash, those things that are only osur midrabanon in the Beis Hamikdash are mutter. However, Rabbi Nosson here, according to Rabbi Nosson, nonetheless, it would be a problem in the Beis Hamikdash. The Tanya, Reb Nosson Omer, Reb Nosson said, Shvus tzricha hitiru. The only types of isurim derabonon that were allowed in the Beis Hamikdash are those that were necessary. Shvus she'ina tzricha. But a derabonon which is not necessary, lo hitiru. Even in the Beis Hamikdash, they didn't allow it. And since over here, sweeping the floor was something that was not really necessary, and therefore, even the Chachomim of Rabbi Eliezer will agree that the Kohanim should not have done that. Continues the Gemara. We saw in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kois Hoyom Memali, that when the blood would pile up on the floor of the Azara, and before letting all the blood drain out of a hole in the wall of the Azara, they would take a cupful of the blood and throw it onto the wall of the Mizbeach, and V'loi Hoidu le Chachomim, the Chachomim didn't agree with what they were doing. Says the Gemara Tanya, we learnt in a Brisa, and in the Brisa we're going to see a little bit more about this dialogue between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachomim as to whether it was necessary or whether there was any point of taking a cupful of this blood and throwing it onto the wall of the Mizbeach. And Before we even see inside, according to Rabbi Yehuda, why did they do this? There was always the fear that with the vast amount of korbanos and the speed that everything was going on those few hours on Erev Pesach, that one of the korbanos, their blood, didn't make it to the Mizbeach. And we need it to be sprinkled. The korban will only atone and is only kosher if the blood is put onto the Mizbeach. So therefore they would take a cup full of blood, and then even in the event that was a korban whose blood got spilt, a few drops of that blood, which was mixed into all the rest of the blood, will probably be in this cup. With liquids, they mix with each other, and therefore they would throw it onto the Mizbeach, and that way all the korbanos would certainly have had their minimum requirement of zrika. Let's see the brayso inside. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, they would take a cupful of this blood, the mixture of bloods on the floor of the Mizbeach, of the Beis Hamikdash, so that in the event that the blood of one of the korbanos got spilled, then this cupful will make that korban kosher. They said to Rabbi Yehuda, the blood on the floor flowed straight from the animal onto the floor. It was never received in a kli, and we know that blood that went straight from the neck of the animal onto the floor and only then was scooped up in a kli is not kosher for zrika. So you, Rabbi Yehuda, you're taking the blood from the floor. It can't be a kosher zrika. Says the Gemara, how do you know that the blood I'm scooping up from the floor is not blood that was first received in a vessel? What the Chachamim actually said was, you have this korban and you don't know if its blood found its way to the Mizbeach. What does it help that you're scooping up the blood from the floor? It could be that the blood of this animal went straight onto the floor, not via a vessel, and if it didn't first go via a vessel, then before spilling, it's not going to be kosher for the zrika. Yehuda said to them, you're right. In the event that the blood spilled straight from the animal onto the floor, then what I'm doing won't help. But I, Rabbi Yehuda, say that since it could be that there was blood that was received in this bowl, and only then it spilt, and if it doesn't get to the Mizbeach, the animal, the korban is not kosher, I want to collect a cupful of this blood in order that those korbanos should be kosher. Asks the Gemara, Mino Yoda. And why do you assume that Bichlal, that the blood that was on the floor was first received in a vessel, in a bowl, and then spilt? Why should that be the case? Kohanim's reason, since Kohanim are very meticulous to do their job properly, and therefore we take it for granted that no korban, or the korban Pesach, would have been let to just its blood flow onto the floor without it being received in a vessel. So we take it for granted it was received in the vessel. Asks the Gemara, is risen, if they're so meticulous and so zrizin, amai mishtapich, then why did it spill after they received the blood? Agav zrizusaihu da'ovdi mishtapich. Since they were working so fast, after they received the blood, it could be that in transit the blood spilt. But we don't assume that they never received it in the first place. What does it help that you're taking a cup of blood from the vast amount of blood that was on the floor of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Azorah, but amongst the blood there's also a lot of blood which is called dam tamtzis. There's 5 different types of blood discussed otherwise in Shas, and one of them is the dam shanefesh is tolui boy, which is the blood that when that blood leaves the animal, it cannot live. And that's the blood that comes out with force. Afterwards, there's blood that just trickles out. That's called dam tamtzis. Most of the blood on the floor is dam tamtzis, is not dam shanefesh tolui boy. So, and zrikas adam can only be, at this point we assume it can only be with dam shanefesh tolui boy. So even if there is some blood that should have gone onto the Mizbeach, but the amount of blood, there's so much more blood, which is not blood that can go on the Mizbeach, that this blood is going to be is going to be nullified almost with the rest of the blood. So what does it help taking a cup full of this blood? Well, dam tamtis more of boy. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda l'tamei, da'omar dam atamtis dam ma'al yahi. this dam tamtis is also a blood which is fit to be used for zrika, to make a carbon kosher. The Tani we learned in a brisa, dama tamtis ba'azhara. According to the Tanakama, if somebody drinks blood, which is not the blood that the nefesh is toli boy, it's just the blood that trickles out of an animal a few moments after it gets shechted, not immediately after it gets shechted, then it's only a lav, it's not got the regular chorus for drinking blood. Rabbi Yehuda Omer bihi koris. Rabbi Yehuda says that even dam hatamtzis is chorus, it's considered dam, it's got the same status as dam shanefesh toli boy. So too for the zrika, it's good enough. Ask the Gemara, V'omer Rabbi Elazar moider Rabbi Yehuda le'inin kapara she'ena mechaper. Rabbi Elazar says that Rabbi Yehuda agrees that that's only true regarding the issa of drinking blood, but regarding the kapara of doing the zrika of a korban, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that the only blood you can use is blood shanefesh toli boy and not dam tamtzis. Shneimar, as it says in the pasuk, ki hadam hu hanefesh yechaper, that the type of blood which is mechaper is only the dam hu hanefesh, which the life of the animal is dependent on it. Dam shanefesh yetze boy mechaper, dam she'ena nefesh yetze boy eina mechaper. Only blood that the life force, the spirit of the animal is dependent on it, can be used for atonement, and not the other blood. Elo, says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda letamei, the reason Rabbi Yehuda said that there was some use in taking this cup of blood was not because the other bloods could also be used for zrika. No, but he says, the Omar ein dam mevatel dam. The Rabbi Yehuda holds that blood is not mevatel blood, since it's of the same nature, the same physical nature, and dam is not mevatel dam. And Rashi brings where this could have other halachic ramifications of this, but dam is not mevatel dam, and therefore, even though there's only a tiny bit of this particular korban's blood in this whole mixture, it doesn't matter. It's not bottle, and you can take a cupful, and it will make that korban kosher. Continues the Gemara. Samechei Amud Beis. Tanya, Omar len Rabbi Yehuda lechachomim. Rabbi Yehuda asked the chachomim as follows: Ledivreichem, according to you chachomim, lama poikekin es ha'azara. Now there was a stream that was flowing through the Azara, and there would be on the wall of the Beis Hamikdash and the wall of the Azara, there would be a hole, and the water would constantly flow through the Azara and out. When they wanted to sweep and to clean up the Azara from the blood that had spilt there, they would block up the end of this stream, and then it would overflow into the floor of the Azara, and obviously this stream was somewhat lowered into the floor. It would overflow, and then they would be able to use that water to clean the Azara. And normally this stream would be flowing, and any blood that would flow into the stream, from a lot of the blood that was spilt on the floor of the Beis Hamikdash, would flow out. On Erev Pesach, however, they would block up this exit, allowing all the blood to pile up in the Azara. So Rabbi Yehuda says, according to me, I need this blood to pile up, because we're afraid that maybe there was a korban that after the blood was received, the blood spilt. I need to be able to take this cupful and pour it on and throw it onto the mizbeach. Therefore, I'm blocking up the exit of the water in order that nothing should flow out, and we shouldn't lose this blood. But you chachomim, who you say that there's no point in doing this because of the reasons we saw before, then why did you block up the exit of this stream? L'divreichem, according to you chachomim, lama poikekin, why did you plug up es ha'azara, the hole that's stopping the liquids, the waters, from flowing out of the Azara? Omruloi, the Chachamim said, Rabbi Yehuda, shevachu lebnei Aaron. It's a praise for Aaron HaKohen, for the bnei Aaron, for the Kohanim, sheyilchu ad arkavuseim bedam, that they should be so engaged in the mitzvah, and they should have so much pleasure with the mitzvahs, that they should be up to their knees in the blood of the Korban Pesachs. And in order to show their love for the mitzvahs, therefore they would allow the blood to pile up. Asks the Gemara, we know that there's a halacha that the Kohanim have to be doing their avodah whilst they're standing on the floor of the Azara. And if you've got blood on the floor, they're not standing on the floor. There's a chatzitza, there's a separation between their feet and the floors, and the avodah will be possible. Answers the Gemara, lachu, since it was liquid, it wasn't solid, it doesn't separate between the person and the floor. Kedetanya, like we saw in a brisa, hadam v'adyoi, blood, ink, v'acholov, and milk, v'advash, and honey, yeveshim, if they are solid, if they are dry, choytzitzin, then they separate. However, lachin, if they are damp, if they are wet, in choytzitzin, then they do not separate. Ask the Gemara, the clothes of the Kohanim doing the avodah will get stained. Utnana, we learned in the brisa, if the Kohanim's clothes are dirtied or soiled, and he does his avodah that way, psula, the avodah is possible. Over here you're saying that they had blood coming up to their knees, then clearly their clothes are going to get stained, and if their clothes get stained, the avodah is possible. Are you going to suggest they would lift up their cloaks and tuck in the end of their cloaks into their belts, and that way from their knees down their clothes would not be getting dirty? Tanya, did we not learn in the brisa, midoy vad, the pasuk says that the kohanim would have to wear v'lovash hakohen midoy vad. Midoy means fitted linen shirt. That means the linen shirt, the butt has to be midoy, has to be fitted on him. What do we see from the word fitted? Midoy kamidos, it has to be fitted exactly according to his size. That the clothes have to go, his cloak, the long cloak he was wearing has to go right down, or the trousers that he was wearing has to go right to the floor, not be raised off the floor and not be dragging on the floor. It has to be exactly according to the height of the kohen. So you can't lift up his clothes and do the avodah that way. There's a halacha, it has to be exactly on the floor. Says the Gemara, do you know when it was that they would go in blood till their knees was a time when they were not doing the avodah? And since they were not doing the avodah, they could lift up their clothes until their knee height. And what would they be doing that was not avodah? When they would be taking the ivorim, the parts of the korban that has to be put onto the mizbeach, when they would take it to the ramp, that's not an avodah. Delav avodahi, it's not an avodah. And since it's not an avodah, then at that point they were submerged in the blood. V'loi, is it not an avodah? It's clear that a kohen has to do that. A Yisrael cannot bring the limbs and the innards of the animal to the ramp of the mizbeach. It has to be done by a kohen. Since it has to be done by a kohen, it's an avodah. The Tanya we learned in the brisa, v'hikriv hakohen, that the kohen brings near es hakoil hamizbecha. Only a kohen is the one that has to bring the imurim to the mizbeach. Zoi lochas ivorim lekevesh. This is bringing the ivorim to the ramp. It must be done by a kohen, so it must be an avodah. If it's an avodah, then the clothes have to be right onto the floor. Then again, at what point were they submerged in the blood? Without an issue of their clothes getting dirty, which means they were allowed to lift up their clothes, which means it wasn't an avodah. It's talking about when they would bring the woods onto the fireplace on top of the mizbeach. That wasn't an avodah, and at that point they would be submerged in the blood. Says the Gemara, okay, granted, when they brought the woods up onto the mizbeach, then it wasn't an avodah and they would be submerged in the blood. But b'hilochas evorim lekevesh, b'hilochas dam, what about all the other melachas they had to do? Bringing the evorim to the ramp. What about taking the blood to the mizbeach? Miho heicha ozli, how did they manage to go then? If there was so much blood, and it was an avodah, and the clothes had to be right on the floor, and they were not allowed to get stained, how is that possible? Answers the Gemara, Demaski itztava. They would be walking on platforms, and those platforms were attached to the ground, therefore they were not a chatzitza, they were made of stone, and therefore they would walk on top of them, and they would not get soiled by the blood. Continues the Gemara, Keitzad toilinu mafshitin v'chulu, we saw in the Mishnah how they would hang and skin these animals after they were shechted, v'chulu, koru, they would tear open the animal, v'yitzius imurav, they would remove the imurim that they knew had to go on the mizbeach, nosnum b'megis, they would put them into a bowl, v'hiktiron, and would burn them on the Mizbeach, would offer them onto the Mizbeach. And it seems from there that the ones that were opening and removing these parts were the ones that were bringing it to the Mizbeach. Also, could it be that that the very people that were Yisraelim, not Kohanim, the Yisraelim who were doing the skinning of the hides and taking out the imurim, they were the ones to bring it to the Mizbeach? Says the Gemara, no. Ema lehaktirom al gabe mizbeach. Not vehiktiron, that the same people who are taking out the parts would bring it to the Mizbeach. No. They would remove the parts, lehaktiron, and just wait there until somebody, namely a Kohen that was fit to take it to the Mizbeach, would come and take it to the Mizbeach, and Yisrael was not allowed to bring the imurim closer to the Mizbeach at all. Continues the Gemara, that when they were all finished and ready to go home, then they would take the animals, they would go home and roast the Korban Pesach. Tana, we learned in a Brisa, the skins have already been removed, and the Korban Pesach had been opened, the parts that had to go on the Mizbeach were put on the Mizbeach, and now they were ready to take the animal home. So what they would do is they would put the animal, wrap it up within its own skin, umafshil la'achirov, and hang it behind him, and that's how they would take it home. Omer of Ilish said, Tayos, you want to know exactly how they did this? They did this exactly the same way as the Arab merchants were used to carrying their merchandise. And the Mefarshim explained that Rav Ilish was not arguing. He was explaining how they would be mafshel la'achirav, and the Mefarshim discuss here, there's a Yaivetz who discusses exactly what Rav Ilish was trying to impress on us by saying that this was the way that the Arab merchants did it, but that's how they would take the Korban Pesach home. Hadron aloch Tomid Nishchat, B'siyata Deshmai, we finished learning Perek Tomid Nishchat. In Mirz Hashem we're going to do Chazor on Perek Tomid Nishchat, and in the next Shir, in Mirz Hashem, we're going to start the next Perek Elu Dvorim.